security of Americans and others around the world, the economic present and future of the dynamic Asia-Pacific, or it's now called by some the Indo-Pacific. In particular, the question of whether the region, and with it much of the globe, is heading toward greater economic integration or fragmentation, largely as a result of the increasingly polarized rivalry between the two largest economies on the planet, both of which are very active in Asia, the U.S. and China. As we've seen in recent years, these two nations have increasingly come to regard one another as dire threats to their interests, thus resulting in the securitization of most, if not all, of the many arenas where they interact with one another and with the world, whether it be politics or ideology, global order, society, and of course, what we're going to discuss now, economics and to some extent technology. Now, this has all resulted in an increasingly zero-sum US and Chinese approach to policies toward these areas. In the critical economic sphere, we now see the formation of several new groupings in Asia. Most recently, the US created Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, an apparent US counter or alternative in some ways to the CPTPP and the RCEP, which are both also large economic groupings. Although many Asian nations, but not the US or China, belong to all of these groupings. China does belong to RCEP. The United States belongs to neither. It's unclear how they relate to one another, these groupings, and whether they serve now and in the future an interest of the region or the interests of the region overall, or whether they simply reflect this growing fragmentation of economic relations that are driven by the Sino-US rivalry. So to discuss these issues and to take your questions, and by the way, if you have questions to ask, put them please in the question and answer box that you can see on your screen, and I'll look them over as we go along and raise certain questions as might seem appropriate. But what I'd like to do now is introduce our three excellent experts on this issue. And rather than run down their superb credentials and their backgrounds in detail, let me just briefly introduce each of them before we start. Rebecca Stamaria is the Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, Apec, Secretariat based in Singapore, where she advises and provides support for APEC's 21 diverse economic economies. Welcome, Rebecca. Our second panelist is Mark Mealy, Senior Vice President and for Policy at the U.S. Asean Business Council. Mark has over 30 years of experience in international trade and economics and has participated in the U.S. government in various capacities and on the Hill and in the NGO community. Welcome, Mark. And our third panelist is Quincy's own Director of Studies, Sarang Shidore. Sarang's areas of research and analysis are geopolitical risk, grand strategy, and energy climate security with a special emphasis on Asia. Prior to his current role at the Quincy Institute, which he recently joined, Sarang was a senior research scholar at the University of Texas at Austin and a senior global analyst at the geopolitical risk firm Stratfor Inc. So to save time and allow for more discussion and questions from our viewers, I'd like to immediately go into questions rather than have presentations at the beginning for the panelists so that we can start a discussion, and hopefully it will be a discussion and not just separate presentations, and then bring your questions in at the same time. And I'll start with Mark and alternate among the three panelists. But I welcome all of you to, all three panelists to just chime in if you wish to respond to a point made by others or just add something. Just raise your hand or use the hand raise function. Mark, we just had a US ASEAN summit in Washington, which was followed shortly by the unveiling of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. To this point in time, does the IPEF meet your expectations? And if not, how do you think it can be improved? What's your general take on it?
Thanks, Michael. I want to thank the Quincy Institute for inviting me to join Dr. Rebecca for this conversation. Yeah, let me start with, I think it's with regard to the summit, that the U.S. ASEAN Special Leaders Summit that occurred in Washington about 2 weeks before President Biden formally launched the IPEF during his visit to Japan. My initial sense, and again, these are my own views, not the views of the U.S. Asean Business Council or their member companies. My own views is that number one, a very successful launch of the IPEF, particularly when I think about it in terms of before the U.S. ASEAN Special Leaders Summit, we were expecting maybe 2 or 3 of the 10 ASEAN countries to actually be invited to join the launch of IPEF. After the summit and at the launch of the summit, that number became 7 ASEAN member states actually were invited to join the launch of the IPEF. I think that is significant because it could have very easily been, quote unquote, a launch of only, quote unquote, a handful of Asian countries that already have pretty extensive trade policy agreements with the United States, like a Japan or like a Korea, so to speak. So I think in that regard, it was very successful. Secondly, I think we should keep in mind that IPEF, the launch, comes at a time of, number one, a number of years where basically the US government has really not been very active in terms of regional trade policy engagement in Asia, ever since the previous administration decided to withdraw from the TPP. And there almost was a sense in Washington, D.C. that when the United States left, TPP would basically just die. It would just go away because without America, nothing could go forward. That turned out to be a big mistake because we then saw countries like Singapore and Japan and Australia actually carry the TPP forward. Renamed it in terms of the comprehensive and progressive TPP. And today it actually represents one of the most, considered one of the high standard trade policy, preferential trade agreements that exist today in the world. Secondly, I think we should keep in mind that the first 2 years of the Biden administration has actually been one of sort of what I call sort of an internal, deep domestic reflection process on trade policy formulation and really objectives of US trade policy. It's almost kind of like there's been a look inward for the last 18 to 24 months. And I think it is relevant and it is valuable that in spite of that ongoing kind of inward looking reflection process, the administration was able to at least cobble together an initiative and formally launch it in a part of the world that is really the most important part of the global economy, which is the Asia Pacific region. So I think in that context, the launch itself, a success. There's going to be about 4 to 6 weeks of consultations amongst the IPEF participating governments to actually begin to figure out in greater detail what specifically will be included in IPEF, and the individual IPEF member countries will decide which one of the 4 modules where they want to participate, whether it's 1 or 2 or 3 or all 4. Only after that process is complete, I think we'll get a clearer sense of how does IPEF really compare and contrast to the many other existing preferential free trade agreements that exist in Asia, some of the digital economic and trade agreements that already exist in Asia. And we should keep in mind, there are also a number of other preferential trade agreements that are actually being negotiated as we speak that include a number of countries in the region. So I think that's a good way. That's how I'm sort of thinking about it right now.
Great, well, thanks. Well, some people say that the IPEF really isn't as comprehensive, isn't as strong an agreement, at least doesn't appear to be thus far, as either RCEP or the CPTPP, in large part because it doesn't really contain a strong trade element. There isn't a lot in there about trade, which some economists have said to me, if you really haven't got that in there, it's not really doing all that much. It may have some niche issues that it's involved in, but it's not really doing as much as it should be doing. And to some extent, maybe it's duplicating. If it does get into trade, it would start duplicating some things that the other groupings would be doing. And I guess I'd like to ask Rebecca what she thinks about that. I mean, do you think, we've got these 3 big groupings now, the TPP, CPTPP, RCEP, and the IPEF, along with the long-standing entities like Apec, which you're very much involved in. So, I mean, are all these groupings serving the interests of the region? Are they sort of working together in some sense? Or do you think they're unnecessarily duplicative? Or on balance, are they sort of furthering the polarization in the region that is going on between the US and China? What's your take on it?
Thanks again. Thanks, Michael, and thank you to Quincy for inviting me. I must say, let me just get to where we are here in Singapore. I'm in the Apec Secretariat, and we're based in Singapore. Apec, as you mentioned earlier, 21 member economies. It is a different organization from, say, Asean, for example. Asean or the WTO. Those are binding organizations. Apec is a voluntary, non-binding. So we do not have agreements per se, but we generate a lot of conversation around those areas that you're talking about in trade and investment, whether it's environment and trade, gender and trade. These are discussions that we have, and we do a lot of technical discussions as well, and provide capacity building, technical cooperation, so that we can further some of these discussions. We've played a key role in furthering the agenda of the WTO, for example. Through our own discussion. So if you're talking of the different agreements and where APEC, is placed in this, it is how we take those conversations further, because we are non-binding. So we don't have folks negotiating or posturing, So we enable, because of that, we can have very frank and candid conversations. So let me just go back to CPTPP, RCEP, IPEF. We and APEC, the Business Advisory Council of APEC, have had on the table for the longest time the ambition of a free trade area for the Asia Pacific. So when you look at it that way, clearly there's a lot of interest in having us integrate further. So making it sense, because at the end of the day, it's not about the policymakers, it's about the business communities. How do you further business? How do you generate more business? And in a time like this, you need more of that rather than less. So going back to CPTPP, for example, I'd like to say that the genesis of it was in APEC. Like-minded economies in APEC started the process. And then it grew from the P4, from the 4 small economies that started APEC, TPP, to become what it was then, the 12, right? Mm-hmm. And then, the US decided to leave. That's well and good. And as Mark said, it didn't crumble, it went on. Likewise, RCEP. RCEP also, I was at the table when we were contemplating what to do with the various ASEAN agreements. We had ASEAN +1, free trade agreements. And each of those agreements came with their own rules. And it didn't make sense for businesses. Big businesses could manage the administrative costs of using these different agreements if you're exporting to these different countries. But for the smaller ones, it didn't make that much sense. So we wanted to put it together to make to bring the rules. You have one set of rules, let's put it that way, yeah? So that was the genesis, the thought behind RCEP, bringing the 5 ASEAN +1 agreements together. Mm-hmm. And I think we said, when we got around the table to think about it, yes, we were very keen to have all the FTAs in. Unfortunately, as with TPP, someone left. So India left. We still have the door open, mm-hmm. and it's open accession. Those willing and able can come in. That's always the case. Same thing with CPTPP, open accession. Now, all these, essentially, the way we see it, then you have in the region the Pacific Alliance. That's another agreement that's on the table, very progressive. Yes, CPTPP is the gold standard with all the different disciplines in it. RCEP less so, but there is a work plan, a built-in agenda, as they call it. Mm-hmm. And then you have FTAP as our final goal, like our North Star, as it were. And you have IPEF. The IPEF, it's vague for now. It really, you don't have the details. So really, once we get to the details, we will understand what it is. Is it a negotiating body? Is it going to negotiate disciplines? We don't know. So what will happen? And there is, I must say, from a personal perspective, not speaking as APEC, question is, what will happen 2 years down the road, if you have a change in administration, what happens? Will this disappear? Because you recall, during Obama's time, we had this initiative called the Expanded Economic Engagement in ASEAN.
Mm-hmm.
With the change in administration, it went off, right? It went off the table. Today, we are trying again with the plan of action to implement the U.S. ASEAN Strategic Partnership, 2021 to 2025. So we're not sure. Yes, this is an opportunity. IPEF is an opportunity for U.S. to be present in the region again, but for how long? So that's a question I think that all of us would want to see an answer to. So the devil is in the details, as they say, so we'll wait for the details in a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Michael, just on that point, Michael, just to jump really quickly.
Go ahead.
I would, in my opinion, I think these preferential trade initiatives like RCEP and CPTPP are part of the deepening of regional trade cooperation within the Asia Pacific region. So I would make the argument that they actually are influencing how the Asia Pacific region's trade architecture is evolving in the 21st century. They're not the only things shaping that evolution, but I would argue they're some of the biggest sources of influence. And I would make the point that in terms of trade, just like we saw following the 1997 financial crisis, when we saw a number of sort of financial regional cooperation and integration initiatives like the Chiang Mai Initiative, the building of the AMRO as an institution, I would say these initiatives sort of reflect sort of on the trade architecture evolution that's going on within the Asia Pacific region. Again, and I think, again, they are bringing those economies closer together within Asia, not necessarily at the exclusion of the rest of the world, but certainly a deepening of integration within Asia.
But do you think that they're working sort of in coordination, or they're reinforcing each other in building a better, more productive, more integrated economically Asia, or is there a certain amount of competitiveness among them? I mean, the U.S. has already said that it's not open to China joining the IPEF, and China has said that it's interested in the CPTPP. The United States is not interested in the CPTPP, nor is it interested in RCEP. I mean, you have this kind of dynamic that seems to be working where it's sort of great power relations are. I mean, when I look at the IPEF, I sort of see it to some degree, although I'm not an expert on this, as a solution in search of a problem. I mean, what exactly is the problem that IPEF is responding to that the other two groupings are not dealing with? And the only thing I can think of is it's not Chinese, it's American. And the Americans want that framework because they want to provide an alternative for countries to China. And to me, I just think if that indeed is part of the motivation, it's a pretty short-sighted motivation that's going to end up, I think, not serving American or regional interests. So I'm sort of interested in that sort of great power dynamic and how it affects this. And that's why I'd like to ask Saran, what's your take on this? I know you have some views about all this as well, and the main implications really of the Sino-US rivalry for all of these groupings and for growth and stability in the region. What's your take?
Yeah, Michael, thanks. I think I share sentiments of all three of you. So I share some of the optimism that Mark brought to the table earlier, which is the fact that the US is in the game, whereas we had for years the US walking away from TPP, which became the CPTPP and wasn't a part of RCEP anyway. And it has sort of been seen trade and investment as very much anxiety-provoking thing. Whereas now you have the US coming forward with an agenda, with a proposal, which is vague, but it's perhaps a beginning. But there is an issue. There is a problem, as you pointed to, Michael. The old motivation for the United States when it supported many of these initiatives was integration of the region for mutual prosperity. And in that process, it aided US national interests. What it seems to me now, certainly, is that the new motivation is much more geopolitical. I mean, Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, said quite clearly in his media event that the Indo-Pacific strategy, which the Biden administration has already released, the IPEF is a foundational element of that strategy. And if you look at the strategy and you read the strategy, as you know well, Michael, the strategy is all about countering or even containing China. It's about looking at the region as a friend or foe, allies and partners, and not. And China is the not. And it's very much structured around that. So this doesn't seem, and we don't have all the details yet, but it doesn't seem the sort of old approach to let us integrate markets and create scales of economies here that everybody benefits from. This is more about, let's create a grouping of friends and partners and attract others into it such that it achieves certain objectives and displaces maybe, or at least reduces the presence of China. And because, if this is a motivation, if this is an intent, and if that becomes clearer in the months ahead, then I think it's going to be a lot less attractive to many partners. Not all, but a number of partners, perhaps in Southeast Asia, are going to say, well, we want both. We want the United States. They very much want the US in the room. They are very pro-American, but they also want other players, and that includes China, because they've seen in the last 30 years the presence of all players contributing to their prosperity. So why should they now change their formula? So this is the gap between, this could be the gap between where the US is coming from and where the regional states are going. And beyond that, there's also, of course, beyond the why, there's also the how. How does the US actually define this new IPEF proposal? The vagueness has been mentioned. Dr. Rebecca said that, and that's certainly true. It's early days, but we don't have many details. But it's also a issue of talking about rules and standards as the main exhibit A, if you will. And the question is if rules and standards can substitute for market access. Are the rules and standards something that all countries can sign on to? Are they going to be multi-speed ways of countries signing on to them? What about domestic support? I think Dr. Rebecca said that. Is there a possibility that if this is all administrative, as it seems to be, a future administration can walk away from it and we are back to square one? So there are a number of issues in the how that we need more details to understand, and it's still not clear.
Right. Well, Rebecca, or Mark as well, I mean, what's your take on how some of the leaders in the region or the economists, business people look at this whole issue? Are they concerned that, that there's too much kind of competition going on that is more of a zero-sum nature in some of these groupings? Or do they sort of see that, we don't really know yet what's going to happen, and they do all address certain needs for the region, so they might be complementary to some degree, and we just have to wait and see? Or are you sensing that there are sort of concerns about a lot of these groupings getting captured, if you will, by the kind of competition that's going on between the US and China?
Look, for me, Michael, ASEAN is pivotal in all this. So you see ASEAN's presence, they are the central driving force for RCEP. A number of our members are in CPTPP and they are in IPEF. And ASEAN, I think, sees its role as that balance. ASEAN's value chains, the supply chains are so integral and so tied to both sides. So it doesn't serve ASEAN's purpose to side with either. So I see ASEAN as being that playing that mediation, that role, because of the way value chains and supply chains are so interconnected. ASEAN's presence in all of these make the difference. So coming back to IPEF, it's right now we are assuming it is exclusive, right? But we haven't seen it. Whereas CPTPP, RCEP, even when we talk of FTAP going forward, these are inclusive agreements.
Right.
And likewise with the digital economy partnership agreements, that for me is very interesting. It is more interesting than IPEF because that's the future. it is about where our economies in the region are heading. And therein, the integration will be more from a digital economy perspective rather than all these. So anyways, having said all that, ASEAN's role is key in this, in all these agreements. ASEAN will play that mediating, that balancing role going forward, because our supply chains are so interconnected.
Right. Well, IPEF, as I understand it, is supposed to have a strong digital economy component to it.
One of the pillars, right?
It's one of its main components. So, and in that regard, I suppose some countries and business people are thinking that that's an important element that really maybe is not being as well addressed by the other groupings that maybe this could serve to address and thereby complement. But you still have the whole issue of membership. And if you only have certain countries who can participate and not others, then you really are tending, and of course the other country is China mainly, then you're really setting up the possibility of having fragmented digital economies in the region that compete with each other, that really are not necessarily going to serve the interest, particularly when you have such integrated global supply chains that are going on among all the different economies in the region. If there's at the same time a kind of a zero-sum structure that relates to the digital economy, it seems to me like a recipe for a lot of chaos.
No, but that's why the deeper, I think we are focusing too much on IPEC. The conversation should be around deeper and how the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement will grow. Many economies have already voiced an interest in it, right? So it is, for me, I'm seeing a similar pattern to the P4 in the early days when it started, and then it grew. And then P4 became the gold standard when it became the TPP, right? So I would put my money on deeper and see how that develops, because a lot of the disciplines that you need for integrating the digital economy, whether it's data flows, data policies, those are embedded in deeper. So I would put a lot more attention on that.
Can you say a word about DEPA just to explain it a little bit to the audience?
So the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, it involves Singapore, New Zealand, Chile, and I'm trying to think of one other. There are four of Australia, I think. No, Australia is a digital economy agreement with Singapore. So this is where it will gain momentum. This will be the headwinds going, or rather the tailwinds going forward for economic integration. So, and here in the disciplines that we're talking about, even in IPEF, your privacy rules, your data privacy, your flows, data flows, right? All those elements are captured in that agreement.
Right. Now, Mark, I know you have a strong interest in this area too, right?
Yeah,
digital cyber. I'd like to get you into that conversation.
A couple of points. I think in terms of this quote unquote competition that could lead to fragmentation kind of question, I think it's important to remember a couple of things. Number one, in Southeast Asia, ASEAN's 10 member states, their number one trade partner in the world is China, right? And that is an ongoing trade relationship that continues to grow year after year after year.
Right.
So in a sense, while the United States, we've always said, major source of foreign direct investment going into Southeast Asia, China, a major trading partner, they have historically benefited from the quote unquote, the competition and not choosing one or the other. So I think that's clearly going to be ASEAN's, I think, preference for how these various sort of frameworks evolve. Second thing I would mention is that on the digital question, which we think is like the future, right? It's pretty evident that while IPEF has a module on trade, and within that module on trade, there's going to be where the discussions around the digital economy are going to occur. The region, many countries in Asia already have digital trade agreements in place that they're already have been implemented and following. And we've talked about DEPA, for example. Really, Singapore is the other sort of, now I would say really the leader globally in sort of the next generation of digital economic and trade agreements. So they've done a series of bilateral, very, very high standard, future-looking digital agreements with South Korea and also Great Britain. for example. I would dare so say that when the IPEF discussions kind of get going, there is so many existing sets of rules and disciplines and commitments that already exist that countries in IPEF already follow. I'm assuming they're not just simply going to create a whole new wheel here. They're going to pull in what's already being done in various other frameworks. So that's why I think it's important to think in mind. That's why some of these various alternative frameworks don't necessarily cause splintering. They can, in some instances, be the mechanism by which countries begin to form consensuses across
focus their efforts, right?
In that regard. So I think that's another key point. And then lastly, I would say there's going to be a really interesting conversation both within the IPEF context, but also, as we know, there's very high standard provisions around digital agreements on a bilateral basis between the US and Japan, the NAFTA 2.0. I would imagine the United States will want to try to bring those texts, those chapters, those points into the conversation. Now, again, for some countries like Japan and Korea, like, yeah, it's no problem. We're already doing that. So put it in IPEF. The question really becomes for the other 12 or 11 countries that maybe have not participated in any of those bilateral discussions previously, but who are participating in CPTPP's e-commerce chapter. Will they feel comfortable maybe going beyond what they're comfortable doing, right? Because let's understand, every country around the world is on their respective national digital economic journey. And I share Dr. Rebecca's point, as I think around governments in Asia that are thinking about where are we in our own journey? And we see all these other agreements that are out there that are important. Can we pull from a DIPA to influence our own journey? Can we pull from an IPEF to influence our own journey? Those are the kinds of things I think will be really interesting to see how they play out going forward. Because at the end of the day, there is a competition. There's a competition for influence, right? And IPEF is going to have to compete against the other already existing frameworks that exist if they want as many countries as possible to sort of join into IPEF.
I think that's a great point, that there is a sort of internal competitive dynamic that really is built into all these systems, because they do tend to, address similar types of problems in various different ways. And if you can get, countries developing through certain groupings a more effective solution to some of the problems that they face, then you'll have other countries gravitating towards that, and then you'll really see if you can build an overarching kind of a structure for all the countries there. But you still have left this problem of to what extent does China relate to all of this? How much can China be brought into the picture, particularly if you're talking about digital economy, where there's such huge resistance now in the West to China's approach to using digital economy. And so when you have such a huge trade entity in the region like China that influences the decisions of all the countries there to such a high degree, and yet you have topics that are really central to the future of the region that are also embedded in the rivalry with the US and China, it's tough to see how this thing's going to work itself out. If the US and China continue this kind of rivalry, it's going to be really hard to see. I think a lot of Asian countries are in addressing these groupings are going to be caught in the middle, and they're going to really have to try and, I think, influence both Beijing and Washington to be less zero-sum, less exclusionary in their approach to these problems. And I think that's where middle powers in Asia really have a major role. I think they need to speak up more. They shouldn't be reticent about expressing their concerns if they have them, and really talk about how we can overcome some of these differences that are, as Sarang says, based on a lot of geopolitical calculations that many countries may not share.
Michael, I can tell you very quickly, just to jump in really quickly and I go to Sarang. I can tell you that one of the biggest concerns for many countries in Southeast Asia about the IPEF was, one, would all members be allowed to be able to participate? And obviously, again, we went from maybe 3 to 7. So I think The U.S. government did a very good job there. But there was and is a sentiment, because if you look around, as Dr. Rebecca knows this, many of these groupings in terms of the Asia Pacific region operate on a principle of inclusiveness.
Yeah.
That's right.
And the reality is, if countries in the region perceive a regional initiative like IPEF or anything else as not really reflecting that principle, that value,
Right.
it does represent, I think, a challenge for some countries in the region. Not to say that they wouldn't still want to do something bilateral with the United States or expand relationships, but the key thing is, if we want this thing to be perceived as regional,
Right.
this principle of inclusiveness matters to countries.
Yes, absolutely.
Dr. Rebecca, you're nodding your head profusely.
Yes, I agree, because, you know, and here's the thing with IPEF, which is different from the others, is India. The inclusion of India. Folks have, I mean, you cannot dismiss India's presence in IPEF, and that will shape IPEF when they go into what they call a negotiating mode. That will be very interesting for me, because we had India in RCEP, and you know, India stepped out at the last minute. And I think that's one of the reasons, this is just me speculating, that's one of the reasons why you don't have market access in IPEF. And folks, that's a critical thing for us. And that's also the criticism, the early criticism against IPEF, that you don't have market access at all mentioned. But really, if you want India in the room, you cannot talk market access. That's my opinion, and that's why it is shaped the way it's shaped.
This one comment to Mark's point on inclusiveness. In fact, this is the claim. The entire rhetoric from Washington is about that IPEF is inclusive, that the Indo-Pacific strategy is inclusive. Well, that's fantastic. It's fantastic to hear that. The problem is the talk being walked adequately? And when you look at the situation, I mean, just think of any market. When standards are set in a market, whether it's electronics market or what have you, product market, it is those that hold bigger market shares that tend to have more of a voice, because they have more of the products to set the standards. Now, if you look at the market in that sense, China is the biggest supplier, a biggest trade partner to ASEAN, for example. And it naturally, if IPEF is being touted as a rules and standards thing, and China is not in the room, what sort of standard setting is practical, possible, or acceptable? So I think the US has to understand that if it is moving in this direction of rules and standards as a proxy for market access, which is a question mark, whether that can actually make up, then how can you set standards that will be acceptable, that will be positive sum, that will add to prosperity, when you don't have all the players in the room? And this is something that, you know, we don't have an answer for yet.
No, but if you see what happened with the CPTPP or the TPP, it was not your typical or traditional FTA, so it had disciplines. And when they were negotiating those disciplines, I'm sure the US had in mind China, when you've had all the state-owned enterprises disciplines, competition disciplines, IP disciplines. And today, that's the standard, regardless around whatever you say, that's the standard. And I see a similar pattern in IPEF. You're working towards that, and folks sign on to that. You make your own domestic changes, environmental rules, for example. Those changes will come in, and because of the way trade evolves, it becomes the norm. I mean, we were taken aback at that when we were negotiating TPP by all these disciplines, but today that's it. You cannot have a trade agreement without talking of environment, without talking of human rights. You cannot have one without talking about competition. So there you go. Disciplines come regardless.
And yet the U.S. is not part of CPTPP.
That's right. Absolutely.
And deliberately says it will not be. And you have this real resistance for, I think, partly domestic political reasons. Why you just don't have that, and it puts itself at a real disadvantage, I think, by not doing that. And the Chinese, as you well know, have now expressed an interest in joining
CPTPP. Yeah.
If China does join the CPTPP, let's say, if they're able to really meet the standards of that trade agreement, I can't see how the United States could continue to stand outside of it and act as if, you know, the IPEF is really the place to be, if that's the argument that's being made. But I want to ask Sarang, if you would say a little bit more about your view about India and South Asia, because, you know, as we've just said, I mean, they're in some ways they're kind of the odd ones out on Asian integration. They're not a part of the CPTPP or of RCEP or of Apec. India has said, you know, it's signed up to, in fact, IPEF. But what does this say to you about South Asia's role in the evolving U.S. strategy and its divergence from let's say ASEAN states?
Right. So South Asia is, of course, a kind of a disaggregated entity in some ways, because, for example, Pakistan is not seen as a part of the Indo-Pacific vision from Washington. So that's sort of kept separate in many ways. In terms of the other countries, India is obviously the big country in the room, and your Bangladesh and Sri Lanka as significant economies. Bangladesh is actually now doing extremely well in the last several years. It's overtaken India on most dimensions, including per capita GDP as of last year. Wow. So we have potentially a Southeast Asia-like economy emerging with Bangladesh, and has to be watched. But coming back to India, it's an interesting actor, because in many ways it has the most in common with the US. It is not a part of any of these agreements, and it's a part of IPEF. And that's the same situation as the US. And of course, India in the last several years has become a very close geostrategic partner of the US because of China. The Indo-China rivalry has become much worse and much sharper. So it would seem that India is the most enthusiastic, or should be, about IPEF. But when the rubber meets the road, the fact of life that the Indian economy is so different from the United States economy still remains very much a developing country in many parts of many segments of the population, although there are some very high-end sectors in the country, means that India will have some trouble. India and the US will have to figure this out. For example, differences on labor and environmental standards. If that's going to be a big part of the IPEF agenda, India does not meet any standards that organized labor in the United States may want to push, for example, in this administration. Indeed, not just India, there are some Southeast Asian countries, such as Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and a couple of others, who also may have difficulty with this. And in fact, some of them are not a part of IPEF for that reason. Right. So you may have a strategic convergence, but then economic interests come into play, and the economic realities of each country comes into play, and there can be divergence. So we may find out at the end of the day that there's no substitute for discussing things like market access, because at the end of the day, that's the gold standard for having countries see benefits on all sides.
Mm-hmm. I would agree.
Let me bring in a couple of questions here that we've had from our viewers, because we've only got about 15 minutes or so left to go here. One of these, I think, maybe calls for more knowledge or speculation on our part about U.S. Willingness, but there's a question from David Carl. Do you think it'd be possible for the U.S. to sign a TPP-like agreement with a subset of Asian countries, with the most developed countries in Asia, say Japan, South Korea, Australia, or New Zealand, Singapore? This might avoid congressional criticism about what's called the sort of race to the bottom, or not being sufficiently attentive to labor issues, et cetera, while generating some economic and foreign policy benefit for the countries and for the United States. Do you see that as at all possible? Is there possible? Of course, this would be yet another agreement, regional agreement, which I'm not sure adding to what we already have is going to solve many of the problems, but it might at least get the United States more involved in TPP-like interactions. Do you have any thoughts on any of this?
I really think they should just sign. Sorry, Mark. I just think that they should just sign on to the CPTPP. all that was mentioned, all the elements mentioned are in the TPP, the CPTPP. Why duplicate it? And it's the same parties, right?
Right. Yeah,
I was going to say, I think all the countries that the question raised already have bilateral FTAs with the United States. So there wouldn't, I don't necessarily see where there'd be any net change or gain from somehow trying to say, okay, we're now going to call ourselves, instead of 4 or 5 bilaterals, we're calling ourselves a new group, but the same set of commitments and disciplines and rules that already exist.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a minute about what the U.S. views on some of these issues mean here. And Mark, let me ask you, there's a very strong theme in the U.S., especially from organized labor, that trade agreements lead to a lowering of environmental and labor standards everywhere. And ultimately they cause job losses to some degree. So how would you respond to these critics based on your own experience of helping advance a successful U.S. Asean partnership, economic partnership, these concerns about labor standards, environmental standards in these agreements?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, because the U.S. government is not participating in any of these agreements with countries, it's almost like a hypothetical. Like, would it make a difference or not? Because obviously we can be critical of, let's say, the lack of environmental or labor standards in certain countries. And the thinking was, as we all know, back with TPP, that was an opportunity for countries in the region to, in a sense, sign on to higher labor and environmental standards in return for getting market access to the United States market, so to speak. Right. Like, that's sort of the nature of the deal.
Right.
I would put on the table that, and I think Vietnam probably represents one of the most important examples right here from the U.S. bilateral perspective, because in 2021, Vietnam became America's 10th largest trade partner in the world, which, when you think about our own history with Vietnam, that's freaking incredible, so to speak. At the same time, where we are seeing rapid growth in U.S. exports going to Vietnam, and Vietnamese exports coming this way, which, again, people think that's a good thing, right? That shows that both countries are selling more to one another. There's also the dynamic, though, that because, again, for the United States not participating in many of the other existing preferential trade agreements, for U.S.-based producers of goods and services, in other words, jobs being created here, they're actually at a disadvantage. Why? Because companies that also make good products and services in, say, Canada or in Mexico or in Japan, they do have preferential market access to the Vietnamese domestic market. Right. And therefore, their exporters can basically sell a product at 5, 10, or 15% less than a US-based company can do. Right. And unless that US-based company can cut its margins by 5, 10, 15%, so that for the Vietnamese mother who's trying to balance their checkbook and can pick and choose between a Japanese product or a Canadian product, that's a really tough sell for that American company. So I think the challenge really is we've got to basically be engaged if we really want to try to elevate these standards that we say are more consistent with our values. And again, if IPEF represents the first baby step of trying to re-engage, it has to then be followed up by some tangible market access related additional steps down the road. It can't just be, here's IPEF, we're good, here's it done, and then that's it. Right. Because that really and other things.
Yeah, and Mark, Vietnam to me is really a remarkable example for many reasons. I mean, just think of this country whose per capita GDP is comparable to Bangladesh, or a little bit above. It's a member of CPTPP, it's a member of RCEP, and it's a member of IPEF. And
APEC, and a member of
APEC, all of them. And it doesn't seem to be deterred and anxious. Right. And this is not a country with a huge population or major power. It's not a major power as such, the middle power. And then again, it has worked with the U.S., a former rival, which we bombed Vietnam, and of course they killed American troops. It was a terrible war. and yet they're a part of all this. They're also working with China. I mean, how do they do this? And can we learn from the Vietnamese?
Excellent point.
Well, yeah, I think they're remarkable. I mean,
Absolutely.
they really
Absolutely.
don't want to discriminate against anybody.
Yeah.
And they're
Yeah.
balanced. They want to balance. They gain by balancing everybody and by being involved with everybody. And I think it's to the general benefit of the region. And I think if other countries could have that same view, and I hope many in Asia do, and it sounds like they do, I think that could really serve to try and overcome some of these divisions that we're talking about. But I'd like to just try and get a little bit more on the issue. And we talked about environmental standards, but I'd like to ask Sarang in particular if he has, and Mark and Dr. Rebecca as well, on the whole question of climate cooperation in Asia and what that means. I mean, it's really in many ways deeply tied to the economic future of the region, and the U.S. talks about it a lot, but has it really sort of, as Sarang says, walked the talk on this? And what do you think the U.S. could do differently to be able to better engage with Asia on questions of climate? Sarang, maybe you could start, and Dr. Rebecca or Mark could add a few comments.
Sure. It's a very important question, obviously, and especially with the Biden administration, it's made it a priority, and very rightly so. So I think that's been a big positive in terms of stressing the issue and making it so important. In terms of action, it's a mixed bag, as often happens in these situations. So, for example, the U.S. has talked about and has urged countries in the region. There are some Southeast Asian countries that are still dependent on coal. India as well, for example, have a lot of coal power. And the US never misses a chance to talk about it, which is a good thing. The US has also backed some concrete actions through the DFC in terms of the International Development Finance Corporation that has about tens of billions, I believe it's $60 billion to spend on investment, development-oriented investment. There are programs on climate change. The ADB, which is a US-backed multilateral bank, has its own energy transition mechanism where it's tried to phase out coal in some of these countries in Southeast Asia. So there are some things happening, positive things happening. But again, all the good news stops when it comes to China in many ways, because the U.S. China cooperation is central to solving the climate crisis. And so far, because of the geopolitical situation, we just are not seeing that kind of cooperation. In fact, the cooperation we used to have under the Obama administration is also not really in evidence. Just telling China that it needs to decarbonize faster is not climate cooperation. There has to be a proactive agenda of joint, pooling minds and money for joint innovation. We need a lot of innovation if you're going to get to 2 degrees or below, which is a tough sell right now. We need to lower market and non-market barriers to clean energy products. There have been a lot of investigations on solar panels, some of them justified, but again, how much of that is really protectionist, how much of that is more justifiable is a question. There's also other things the US can do. For example, the region, especially some countries in Southeast Asia, are vulnerable to major natural disasters in the future in a climate-wracked world. And the US is, again, active in this, but I think it could be better if the US cooperated with all countries in the region, including China, to bring all these state capacities to bear. If tomorrow, let's say, God forbid, if a massive calamity, a disaster were to strike a less wealthy Southeast Asian country, we will need all that capacity there to ensure that there is not human distress, but also not instability in the region. In countries like Myanmar, there's already so many issues, and it is so vulnerable to climate change. And we in the US don't have a good relationship with Myanmar, but China does. So there are many things that can be done that are not being done.
Right.
Yeah. Just to chip in here, it's what all said and done in APEC, we have US and China. And there is collaboration in these fronts, specifically in capacity building technical cooperation. We have projects where both US and China and Japan either fund them or provide the necessary expertise to bring folks up to speed on this. And one big area that we are pushing for under Thai, because this year as Thai is chair, the Thailand is chair, they are having a big push for sustainability. And we in Apec support the WTO commitments on fossil fuel subsidies, and we keep repeating it. There are members who, of course, there's some members who are not quite enthusiastic about it, but because of the push, you see more and more of APEC member economies supporting the voluntary standstill of inefficient fuel subsidies at the WTO. So we hope that at the MC12 we get something coming out at least in one of these areas.
That's great. I didn't realize that APEC was a really major force in getting China and the United States to cooperate on this question.
I mean, it's there.
We need as much optimism as we can get here.
Yeah.
Mark, did you have a comment?
Two things very quickly. Number one, I give the Biden administration credit for just this week deciding to basically, I guess, reduce some import duties on renewable energy products coming from countries in Southeast Asia. Because in a sense saying, if we want to do better here in our own country about moving towards renewables, and there are world-class producers of those types of products, in addition to what we can produce here, we should allow that product to come here so we can also move forward as well. I would also note that a number of countries in Southeast Asia are moving forward with their own sort of national energy transition roadmaps, again, trying to achieve their emissions goals. There are opportunities for sure for the United States, either solo or in tandem with other partners, to really work with some of those nations that really say, here is our game plan. Can you fit into our game plan and help us go to where we want to take these kinds of, I think Indonesia is going to be a very interesting test case in that space.
Yeah, and again, Mark, coming back to Vietnam, it's had a stellar solar success story in the last few years. I mean, it's just been remarkable how that's grown.
Yep.
So,
well, that's great. Well, we're almost out of time. We have a little bit of time left. Let me just take one last question here from one of the viewers, Alvin Sayajian. Sorry if I butchered your last name. With the vagueness and the lack of free trade provisions in IPEF, would countries likely prioritize fulfilling RCEP commitments over IPEF ones? Now, this gets back to the whole issue of trade-offs and how zero-sum is this? Is this kind of a possible dynamic that we could see in the future? If really IPEF is not really providing the kind of clarity and the kind of strength that many countries think they need, then they will move to prioritizing other commitments under other groupings. It sounds to me like it's kind of a logical thing that could very well happen. And that would really end up really backfiring for the United States. So it really does need to inject some real specificity into the IPEF, obviously, and it needs to make it very attractive, I think, in very positive some ways, as you say, from the inclusiveness point of view to other countries. So I hope the United States reconsiders what looks like its desire not to have China participate in this. But does anybody else have any comments on this? Or
well, we don't have much time, but the other agreements are already in place. Commitments have been made. It's an agreement, so you've got to implement it. It's not a trade-off at all. No. Yeah.
So if the agreements are there, you got to follow through on them. Mark?
Yeah, I would make the argument that I think while we've noted that RCEP is quote unquote not considered a gold standard agreement, one thing is very, very clear. For the 14 nations that are participating within the Asia region, the RCEP commitments around rules of origin and enabling basically preferential market access for trade within RCEP is commercially very significant and will be a significant driver of, I would say, increasing relative trade for those countries within Asia relative to the outside world, because it's going to make it easier for trade within Asia. And that's just a reality that we're going to see in the years ahead.
Yeah, and I'll just say that all of the geopolitics that we are seeing, U.S. trade with Asia continues to boom. So it's one of those things where, the forces of economics seem to be still fairly strong,
Right.
and we hope that they continue to remain that way.
Absolutely.
So I got to make one point there in closing.
Yep.
While the overall trade is booming, and Vietnam is a good example, the nature of Vietnam's imports from the rest of the world, United States and Europe, are relative to their imports from within Asia, are beginning to go on a downward trend.
Yeah.
That's not just simply because of RCEP and the it's just more efficient to trade. It's also a reflection of the fact that we all said Vietnam now produces so many of the things that they used to import from America and import from Europe. They now make them themselves for export, but also for their own domestic consumers. That, I think, creates, again, a challenge for US-based exporters of goods and services going forward.
Well, Mark, you ended on a slightly less than high note from one that we were about to end on a second ago, but that's okay, because it was a very, very interesting and important point. We are out of time, unfortunately. I hope you found this discussion to be informative and interesting. I certainly did, and I learned a lot. My great thanks to all three panelists and to the viewers and to all of those who asked questions. I didn't get to everybody, I'm sorry, but thank you very much for participating. Please go to our website to find out about our upcoming events at the Quincy Institute. In the Asia arena, we'll soon be unveiling a major study on the US force posture in Asia, and we'll hold events on that. And on my recently released study of threat inflation in the Chinese military. We've also recently issued an essay by Sarong and our colleague Jess Lee on the dangers of pushing South Korea toward a China containment policy. So a lot of things going on at the Quincy Institute. So please keep track of our site and read our work and participate. And thank you all very much. And thanks again to Mark, to Dr. Rebecca, and to Sarong.